Ninjago as a franchise has had a multitude of different concepts from over the years, and unfortunately, not everything can get realized to the vision that it was initially set out for. And it is a massive shame because Ninjago already has so many fantastic ideas, and there's a chance that there could have been so many more that we just simply never got to see. But that actually comes under a certain term that is used almost universally with any piece of media, and that is lost media. And if you don't know the definition of lost media, it goes as such. Lost media is any type of media that is no longer existent in any format, or which no copies can be located, partial or otherwise. The term primarily encompasses visual, audio, or audio-visual media, such as films, television, radio broadcast music, and video games. And Ninjago has had plenty of them, but luckily the fantastic team behind the show typically tells us about these pieces of lost media, and whether or not they ended up becoming something else, or simply they were just vaulted, never to be seen again. But that is what I want to look into today, and take a look at these amazing pieces that we potentially could have gotten. So sit back, relax, and let's look through what could have been with Ninjago. Now, there are many pieces of Ninjago media, and I do think that is very interesting, but I have isolated it down to 5 specific things I wanted to talk about today. And the first one actually comes from the mobile games that we initially had back in the earlier days. Of course, there are some that still stick around to this very day, such as Shadow of Ronin, but the thing is that there are many that we just simply no longer have access to. Most of the classic seasons of Ninjago actually did have an associated mobile game. The only ones that didn't get it, as far as I'm aware, was actually Season 5 and also Season 7, but the rest did actually have an app. The pilots in Season 1 had this really interesting spinner game to associate with the sets, which was pretty cool, but fairly simple at that. You had the Final Battle app, which took you with all of the ninja fighting against Stone Warriors, which was very fun. You also had the rebooted game, which was just a run along, avoid the obstacles type game. You had the tournament game, which had a lot of playable characters where you'd fight through waves and an eventual boss. And then you would get to the Skybound game, which was a lot and kind of worthy of another video in of itself. And then to finalize it all off, you had the Woo Crew game, which was another very fun one in my opinion. Personally speaking, I played basically all of these games, but some more than others. The ones for me when I was a kid, or my personal favourites, was definitely Tournament. The large roster was really cool, and the wave fighting mechanic was also very interesting to see. The Final Battle was also really interesting. I do find it funny, there were some really interesting design choices in that game, but I kind of digress on that one. And Woo Crew was also very fun and kind of ahead of its time. Honestly, this one was really good for what it was, and it still shocks me to this day that we did actually get it. But unfortunately, this isn't a video about me looking over Ninjago mobile games, but if you do want that, please let me know. But ultimately speaking, all of these have become lost media, and it comes down to a multitude of different factors. Of course, eventually companies will lose the license, eventually they just get delisted due to a lack of downloads, and just other little bits and pieces such as lack of support, which is just a massive shame. But some of these to this very day, you can technically still download. For example, Woo Crew and Skybound, if you did download them back in the day, you can still re-download them to your phone today. But most of the earlier ones, such as Tournament and the pilot ones, they are all locked behind earlier iOS instances. So unfortunately, those are officially lost to time. You can find some ways to maybe get them back. I believe if you do have older iPhones, you can still do it. But ultimately speaking, you can no longer access these games in an easy sense. And it is a massive shame because Ninjago is definitely missing more games in its roster. But ultimately, these games were really fun and very interesting to actually see, and I do wish to this very day we still got games like this. It's just ultimately speaking, I just don't think they see it as overly worth it. But that was the first piece of lost media to take a look at, and now let's take a look at the second one. And this one is a fairly infamous one at that, and that actually does come from the character of Mr. E. Ultimately speaking, the concept for him was very different, and we do actually have some snippets of what was initially going to be the case for him, but ultimately, the main bulk of what was meant to be Mr. E has never come to light, and that is of course the case of him being Echo Zane. We do have a very small clip showing this off to this very day, but for the most part, most of the pre-viz and most of the early animation for Mr. E has definitely become lost to time. Of course, his plot was meant to be very different like I said, but ultimately they did scrap this concept because they didn't want to have to explain away who and what Mr. E was to newer fans of the show. This has actually led to a lot of people to this very day still classifying Mr. E as Echo Zane, but ultimately speaking, because this is now by all account lost media, it doesn't actually count towards what the character truly was. Mr. E to this very day is a mystery, and that honestly I'm kind of okay with, because I don't really consider it to be Echo Zane just because of the initial concept. But like I said, most of the footage relating to Mr. E has become lost to time. Apart from that one very small clip we have, that is literally it. It would have been very cool if we could have had all of this preserved in a much better way, but unfortunately it was never the case. So, forevermore, we will only ever have this one singular screenshot of Mr. E being Echo Zane. But that was the second one, and it is fairly interesting to look back at it, especially considering how people to this day still consider it to be the case. The third piece of lost media today is actually going to be something by the name of Ninjago Reconnect. Honestly, this is really interesting, but unfortunately we don't know too much about it. We got a singular tweet from Tommy Andreasen when it does come to it, but Ninjago Reconnect was going to be 4 shorts, 5 minutes each, and each one focused on one of the original ninjas' quest to regain their powers after the events have crystallized. But ultimately speaking, it never came to light, but it did become something else in the process. And this was actually the book, The Quest for the Lost Powers. Tommy Andreasen has specifically noted that whilst it's not one for one with the original shorts that he pitched, it's actually very similar in its nature, and the stories do take on a very similar approach. And honestly, I do find it very interesting that this was actually the case. Because whilst it's good that it was explored within a book and it was realised in some capacity, and also it was probably able to be expanded on more within the book, the thing is that if it was created as the original shorts like they presented it as, it would have been much better for the fans. Because like I said, it definitely would have bridged the gap between Crystallized and Dragon's Rising a bit better, because most fans probably haven't actually read this book. So as it goes for how they got their powers back, it probably remains a mystery for most. And not to mention, it would have been very cool to have seen these shorts actually being realised, because the book does have a lot of characters that we hadn't seen in the show for a very long time at this point. Of course, we would have seen Unagami, we would have seen Skylar, we would have seen Cole's father. There would have been a lot of different characters that would have been nice to have actually seen again, especially just considering that not many things are done with these characters. So ultimately speaking, I'm actually very sad that this has remained lost media. We don't know if anything was ever fully realised, like if any early animation was done, but all we know is the fact that they were meant to be the case, but forevermore, they will just remain as a book and not the shorts. The fourth piece of lost media that we're going to talk about today is actually an unpublished story that we were meant to get in relation to Skylar, and more specifically her mother, and it was actually by the name of Amber Legacy. It was an unpublished story, like I said, that would have introduced Skylar's mother and explained why she wasn't in the Serpentine War, why she married Chen, and what her ultimate fate was. But unfortunately, this story was not released due to the poor distribution of the Dark Island trilogy. But it was interesting because this also did end up becoming something else in similar vein to what we were talking about previously. What this unused concept eventually became was actually Amber Spiral. It was loosely based off of Amber Legacy, but it was released on Lego.com in 2022. But as for the full realized story of Skylar's mother, we never actually got it to be the case. The only thing we ever actually got is the art that you currently see on screen. This is literally all we have in terms of what Amber Legacy could have been, and it's honestly very interesting to see because obviously it has Kai, it has the Devourer, and it also has Skylar as well. Honestly, it's a very interesting combination of characters and definitely does pique my interest. But like I said, down to poor distribution of the Dark Island trilogy, we just simply never got this story. And as far as we can tell, this story simply is just laying around in Lego's vault somewhere. Will they do something with it later down the line? Probably not, because of the existence of Amber Spiral. But as we stand, there is a story that fully explains a character we know next to nothing about, that we just simply don't know about. And it is an ultimate shame, because it would be very interesting to understand Skylar's mother. It would have been very interesting to understand Skylar's mother's relationship with Chen and her whole influence on everything that came around it. Honestly, it is a massive missed potential in my opinion, because there's so much concept that you could get from it, especially considering that the LEGO are intended on expanding on the Serpentine Wars era of Ninjago. But hey, who knows? Considering that next year, as of the time of filming, we're meant to begin a Serpentine Wars comics, maybe we will get introduced to Skylar's mother and we will finally get those answers. But until that ever does get confirmed, until then, it is unconfirmed everything about this character. But that does lead us on to the final piece of Ninjago lost media, and honestly in my opinion, this one is the biggest shame of the bunch, and it's actually to do with the pilot episodes, or more specifically the concept of remaking them. Tommy Andreasen actually proposed that for the 10th anniversary of the show, we would actually get a full remake of the pilot episodes. It would have been 44 minutes and would have been a complete re-showing of what actually happened in those original events. And honestly, that would have been absolutely fantastic. But again, this project was never realized because the budget simply didn't allow for it. And not only is this a shame because it would have been very cool to have seen those pilot episodes redone in the modern day, but the other thing that's a massive shame that comes from it is the fact that it honestly would have been a great opportunity to finally have the pilot episodes easily accessible. Because as it stands, even though the pilot episodes aren't lost media by any account, it is still extremely difficult to actually get your hands on them. So having a modern remake may have actually been able to show new Ninjago fans where Ninjago actually came from at a very easy source. But like I said, ultimately speaking, we don't know much more about the remake outside of the fact that it never happened because of budget, and it's just a massive shame to know that we could have had that being the case. Of course, we're talking about 2021 here, so this is the year the Seabound came out, so honestly, I am not surprised because you can see the budget restrictions reflected in a lot of different moments, such as a lot of asset reuse and animation reuse within Seabound itself, and also a much more reduced set line. So ultimately, I do think it would have been a fantastic idea that they could have done, it's just they picked a very bad time to actually do it. Hey, but maybe that is going to be the 15th anniversary announcement that we have been told is going to be the case. But as it stands, the pilot's remake is again lost media. But on an overall, all of these are very interesting to actually see, and the thing is that we know for a fact that basically all of these do have some sort of concept material out there that we just simply never actually got to see, and that is the biggest shame of all, because lost media does suck because it is a very interesting hypothetical of what we could have got as Ninjago fans. But this is where I want to pass it off to you guys. What is your favorite piece of Ninjago lost media? Is there anything that stands out, anything in particular that you would have wanted? It is very interesting to note that there is so much out there that you could have potentially have had that you just simply never got. But that's why I want to know what you would have wanted the most of the bunch. Personally speaking, honestly, I think I would have wanted to have seen those shorts that actually showed the ninja getting their powers back. But that is just personally me, and I want to know what you think. But thank you very much for watching the video, and I do hope you enjoyed. And if you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing. I love talking about Ninjago with more people. And if you did enjoy the videos and you want to support the channel any further, which you do not have to, you could always consider becoming a channel member. You could join the eternal legends that you do see on screen. And a particular shout out to Grandmaster Sensei 28208. Thank you very much, my friend. But that is about it for today, you guys. And thank you very much for watching. Take care. Okay.